To begin with, people that know me will know that one of my favorite topics of conversation is this country going to the dogs, as I always describe it. And I think there are many reasons why Britain is going in the wrong direction. Problems to do with, everything from economic things, people struggling to buy a house, and the financial system with fractional reserve banking, and the cost of land, and high taxes. And then there's also a load of social reasons: social cohesion, low trust society, degenerate culture, all this sort of stuff. And empires go through cycles, so we're told. And I think we're in very much the declining stages. And I just wondered if you sort of agree with that assessment that we are, in the sort of dying stages of a civilization.
Yeah, well, look, great to be on the call, and I think it's pretty accurate. I think everyone can see that we've lost a sense of vitality, and I think that comes back to the core question of what is life about? What is a people about? What is a nation about? What is a civilization about? And I don't know about you, but probably 20 years ago now, I was quite swept up in what you could call the ethos of modernity. I was into sort of like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And my life was kind of drinking alcohol and, studying a bit and trying to get laid, really. Now that's fun when you're in your 20s, I guess, especially your early 20s. But the older I got, the more I started to think, is this it? Is this what life is? And for some people, that's fine if they enjoy that. But for me personally, it got to a point where just something very deep within me was saying this just isn't right. This isn't fitting correctly with my soul, if you will. I wouldn't have used that language back then, but it just felt to me like something was missing, something essential. And I think that's quite hard for modern people to put their finger on because all of our lives, ever since we're very young, everything is focused on the material wealth, looking good in the world, having money, all that sort of stuff. And don't get me wrong, that stuff is great on one level. But I think as you get older, you do start to yearn for something deeper. And I suppose you could say I've always had that religious side to me. And when I say religious, I don't necessarily mean of religions. I just mean a devotional side to me, a side to me that wants to connect with something bigger than myself, whether that literally be God and religion, or whether it also be, a movement, a tradition,
Mm.
serving something that just means more, and it kind of put me on that journey of looking for what that could be. And it's just you just can't really find anything today. I mean, you find bits and bobs here and there, don't get me wrong, but it always seems like it just feeds you back into just the mainstream again.
Mm.
And I found it deeply unsatisfying, and that led me to perhaps search a bit deeper than the average person. Not that I, went incredibly deep. There are people out there that I think could offer better insights than me, but I still went deep enough to realize, okay, we've lost something here. There's something that our ancestors had that it seems that we've lost, and they maybe didn't have the material wealth, but they had something, and I can even sense it in my grandparents. Actually, I've only got one grandparent left, but she's not, and I don't mean to be mean to her. I love her dearly, but she was never the most book smart person in the world. But when you talk to her, there's this wisdom in there, just a wisdom about how you live life, about values, about morals. And I can even sense it in our conversations that there's something there that just I never got. So in principle, the
Mm.
point I'm getting to is that led me to agree with your point that we're in this sense of civilizational decline, in the sense we've lost a vitality, perhaps a unity, a shared moral message amongst the people, a shared mythos, a shared story, a
Mm.
shared idea of who we are. And I made a video on my Substack recently actually talking about this. And the title of it was Britain is in an identity crisis. And I think it is. I just don't think we know what we are. And in a sense, I think that's true for a lot of the Western world. You could argue America is finding itself to an extent with Trump, but personally, I think that's more a short-term break, if you like, in the general trend of things. And there's, arguments as to whether Trump really would touch into perhaps these deeper aspects I'm talking about anyway. Is MAGA really about old school tradition, or is it about the kind of 80s, 90s libertarianism?
Mm.
But in essence, the point I'm getting to is yeah. I mean, it seems to me that we've lost some of those essential truths, perhaps in the temptations and materialism of modernity, and perhaps now, maybe it's because I'm getting older, but I don't seem to be the only person who's thinking this way. More and more people are thinking, yeah, there's something missing. There's something essential missing. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I feel it, and I speak to many people from many different walks of life, young and old, who feel that quite keenly. So I hope that answers your
Mm.
question. I threw a lot out there, but I hope that yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched upon, a load of things that I kind of wanted to bring up today. The sort of the loss of meaning in our lives is one of them. We've sort of sold this idea that, the sort of point of our existence is to basically, accumulate as much wealth, material possessions as we can, and to achieve the highest possible social status. And essentially, it's a very sort of individualistic philosophy and approach to life. And that's actually something I was going to touch on later, is this sort of individualism versus collectivism. But maybe we could sort of, explore it now. Because, yeah, it does seem to me that and again, you mentioned that sort of 80s and 90s sort of Thatcher Reagan economic boom, and a lot of sense of optimism there, and a little bit of a economic resurgence, and that does seem to be what's trying to be recaptured at the moment in the West. With figures like Trump and people like Nigel Farage and reform. But yeah, this idea of individualism, it's funny because I've always sort of thought of myself as being very much an individualist, and I think it is nuance as well. It depends what people mean by those terms, individualism and collectivism. And, I sort of, people that know me well will know that some of my, main philosophical convictions come from the philosopher and author Ayn Rand, and she spoke a lot about these terms. And of course, they need strict definitions. And again, that's another problem that we have that I was going to touch on, which is the fact that so many of these labels we give to things are meaningless. This left-right divide. Uh, and I think that sort of divides us. But yeah, with the individualism, the collectivism thing, it does seem to me we pursue all this individualism. It's all me, me, me. We try and become as successful and as important and as impressive as we can. And again, I think neither of us would discount, the advantages to having some focus on yourself. But do you think it sort of reaches a point where that is just like it's not enough to sustain us? And one of the things that my father said a few times, which I think is a really nice bit of wisdom, he said, "Life's all about the people," and that's kind of how I feel. I'm most happy when I'm with people and when I feel a sense of belonging, and that's why I'm so family orientated and that sort of thing. So, yeah, and then maybe let's unpack a little bit of this sort of individualism versus collectivism thing. What are some of the sort of pitfalls and drawbacks to this individualistic approach? Why does it leave us so empty?
Well, yeah, I mean, firstly, it's important to just chime in on the point you were making about the nuance with regards to individualism and collectivism. The point I guess both of us are trying to make here, individualism isn't necessarily bad if it's in the service of the right, if well, in the service of the collective, you could say. And arguably, even in the 80s, that was the case, because you could say, maybe someone who was being hyper individualistic, creating business, creating jobs, creating more wealth coming into the nation that was creating more tax and so on. So there's an argument that having that approach in that era benefited people. And then there's also something to be stated for about, welcoming the qualities in the people who are exceptional. I'm not making a case for just trying to bring humanity, boil humanity down to this indistinguishable sludge. I do think certain people are unique, and I think certain people have gifts that others don't.
Mm.
For instance, I'm very drawn to philosophical ideas, spiritual ideas, and that side of life. I can speak to some people who are completely opposite and think I'm like a different species to you. And I do think that we should welcome these differences in people and try and celebrate those forms of individualism and what they can do and how people can perform very unique things. But at the same time, like I say, I think the key is it serving the collective in some way? And if it doesn't, that's where the problem arises. And I think that's, again, what is happening in the West now, especially in the younger generations. And I think, again, people are experiencing this instinctively more than intellectually.
Mm,
So there's this push, if you like, from the Thatcherite generation. You can arguably even say to an extent America now, where a lot of these ideas are promoted, and it's not like they're wrong. Like a lot of the things they're saying are right. It's great to be a success and have a speedboat and create jobs and live your dreams. That's awesome. But again, it comes back to these bigger questions about life in the service of what? Is it really just in the service of, you being the king, having loads of money, banging all the women, being great, while your country is suffering, while we're undermining, if you like, the values of the nation, the foundations of the nation? They're the big questions. And again, I think we wouldn't have had to consider that in bygone decades in the way that we do now, because there was an underlying structure to our countries maybe 40 years ago that we just don't have now. And these
mm,
are the harsh realities of today. Things such as mass immigration. This changes the nature of a nation. It essentially makes it a free-for-all where people will come here, and the country's treated sort of like an economic zone. And it
yeah.
ends up essentially meaning that everybody's just there to try and get what's theirs, and we're
Mm,
still stuck in this ideology of, well, yeah, but, building business is good. And again, but it's, yeah, but at what cost? Where essentially we don't really have any tradition here anymore, where the numbers are so high that the host population are just getting swamped in some areas. And in, 20 years could be a minority here. Now, of course, to the business elite and arguably to the liberal side, that doesn't matter. They're like, who cares? You're racist, if you have that concern, would be their line. My
mm,
own personal belief is I don't think it's racist at all. I think it's perfectly natural for any man in any country to wish to maintain the traditions of his ancestors, to try and maintain the heart and culture, the heart of his culture, sorry. But more importantly, it was those foundations that allowed us to have the freedom to build businesses and so on in the first place.
mm,
So since we're undermining our own system with this approach, and these come to these broader questions again, which is what do we do it all for? If what are we actually serving? Is it just individual pleasure, individual success, which again to an extent is fine, or could there be a model where we think, do you know what, individual success, individual pleasure is fine, welcoming people in reasonable numbers, to come and work here and aid in the country, yeah, that's all right. But when you get to this, just everything's gone insane, crazy high numbers, crazy high attitudes, you think, well, we're just losing something here again. We're
mm,
losing our very foundations. And that's the question that inspired me. It allowed me to think a bit more collectively in the sense of, no, actually, I do have a nation. I do have a tradition. I do have a way of life which I'd like to keep alive. And, a lot of my sort of education from when I was young would tell me that thinking that way is somehow evil or wrong. But as I got older, I thought, no, I just think this is normal. And I think everyone around the world does it. And like I often say on the YouTube channel, it's not about hating anyone. It's just a realization of what really matters in life for me, which is, God, nation, country, tradition, and these things, matter. Just finally, again, to add, it's not about completely going into those things. We need that dimension of individualism, but ideally they have a sort of symbiotic relationship. And in my view, that creates a more harmonious individual, a more harmonious nation, and a more harmonious world as well.
mm. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Richard. And yeah, it does seem to me that people still sort of really deeply yearn for a sense of meaning in their lives and a sense of belonging. They want to connect with something deeper. They just don't really know how. You see this, I suppose, when people become very impassioned about their football team. And, football's a great sport and, I'm nothing against it. I really enjoy playing football and I can totally understand, a sense of allegiance to your hometown, home or your home city's football club or something like that. But it just seems to me like, there's this real deep passion and, you hate the other clubs, you love your club, there's this real rivalry and it's like it's like a form of tribalism in a way. And it kind of, that kind of tells you everything you need to know that human beings sort of do deep down really want to belong to something, something bigger than themselves. It's like people going to these festivals and stuff, where they're sort of, they're sort of worshipping their favorite pop icons and singing along to the songs. And I've never been to a festival, but, people tell me it's great fun and I'm not really convinced, but there's that sense that you're all together, you're all singing the same songs, like Taylor Swift or Oasis or whatever it is. And, it kind of, it does something inside of you. You know, you feel that sense of belonging and that sense of meaning. So people, you can see sort of people sort of looking for it. They're trying to find some sort of substitute. You know, one of the things you said on the channel the other day that really struck me, I can't remember what video it was, one of the ones in the last couple of weeks. You're talking about all these kind of almost substitutes for meaning in our lives. And you said none of this is really going to cut the mustard. What we do need is God. And so I'd like to speak a little bit about that because you know, people like Alex Jones, you know, they say, you know, the most important thing beyond, you know, looking after our health and, you know, defending our nation is sort of getting right with God. And, you know, a lot of people would scorn at comments like that. You know, to those of us who've been raised in a secular, uh, an atheistic culture, you know, this sort of seems mysterious, this idea of God. So, um, this is where I think, from what you say in your YouTube channel, this is where the deeper meaning can be found. But again, it's something that I think really needs to be demystified. And I have no knowledge on this subject, but you know, as I've got older, a bit like you, I've sort of started to realize that you know there must be something more. And your answer to that is God. I wonder if you could sort of demystify what that is, you know, and maybe starting with you mentioned earlier, sort of like Dawkins and you know that sort of you know the Stephen Fry, Ricky Gervais type. Uh, what would you call it? The rhetoric, I suppose, on God, and it's very dismissive. And we've been brought up in this culture where, like, you hear someone goes to church or believes in God, and you think, "Oh, right, well, you know, why are you doing that? You know, what's wrong in your life that you need to do that? You know, you sort of almost regard it as a bit of an outcast, a bit of an oddball, but it does seem to me that it's something that the culture has sort of encouraged. You know, it sort of seems like religion as a whole, and certainly this idea of God, has been completely undermined and almost ridiculed to an extent. So, yeah, maybe we could speak a little bit about that, and maybe this whole sort of caricature, this silly sort of um, this sort of cartoonized version of God that we're sold by the Dawkins and Gervaises of the world. You know, we sort of imagine him as like this bearded man sitting on a cloud, sort of controlling everything. But where did that come from? And this whole undermining of God as a whole, and you know, what is God? When we talk about getting right with God and God giving us meaning in our life, what does that mean to someone who's been brought up in a very atheistic culture that kind of scorns at the very idea of anything supernatural or beyond this physical realm?
Yeah, well set up with that question because it's hitting the key things really to try and understand this. I think the first place to start is, you know, that kind of new atheism that I was into 20 years ago. In a way, Christopher Hitchens was the first YouTube star. I know he didn't have a channel, but when you think back, he was like the first guy that all the young people were going and watching. And like, it's funny because in a way, Jordan Peterson was the answer to Christopher Hitchens in YouTube lore in many ways. But
Yeah,
anyway,
very
it's
much
a
so.
topic for another time. Yeah, but the first point I want to make is, look, you know, if you were to take that understanding, you know, the mainstream materialistic understanding of conversations about God, yeah, it does seem ridiculous. It seems stupid. And I used to say these things when I was, you know, reading the God Delusion and all this sort of stuff. I
Mm,
think, how can you believe there's a man on a cloud? How stupid are you? You know,
yeah.
like I can see the clouds there. There's no man there. Like, what's wrong with you?
Mm,
And it is silly. And in a way, they do, you know, a lot of these guys, they'll take the lowest hanging fruit. If you do actually go into the debates between some of the atheists and the Christians, you'll see it does get into much deeper territory. But I'd still say they're arguing with what you might call the mainline Christians, which is probably different to what the way I think about it, because I think about it more mystically. But in principle, what I'm saying is there's a cookie cutter version of atheism which most people take on in this day and age. You know, well, God isn't there. He's not talking to me. So why on earth would you say that? That's just madness. And in a sense, they're right, you know.
mm.
But again, you spoke to it when you were talking about these people who go to festivals or a football game. And I think if you've ever been on a stand in a football game and you are singing along, again, there is a spiritual element to it because the core of it is you as an individual somewhat dissipates and you become the crowd. So
Yes,
you
yes,
become something
exactly.
bigger. Yeah, and it's the same principle as when you're walking on a mountain, really. And you get that moment where you turn back and you look and you see all these mountains and rivers and you just have a moment overtake you where you're not thinking about work, you're not thinking about the mistake you made 10 years ago, you're not thinking about what you're going to do in 5 years. You're just in that moment with this majesty around you, and you're sort of swallowed by this thing that's bigger than you. And it might only last a second, but it's real when you're in it. And you
Mm.
really feel something quite profound. And again, you're melting into something bigger than you.
Would you say then, Richard, and sorry to interrupt, but would you say that's almost like an example of us connecting with the divine
I
within us?
personally would, yes. I'd say it's a very direct version of it, but I'd say the reason I'm saying it is it's a metaphor for what spiritual experience is, or at
Mm.
least it is a form of spiritual experience, but we wouldn't understand it in that language in modernity. But again, I mean, look, I may be getting a bit deep here, but the experience I often have, if I have an experience of awe in the mountains, is is it the mountains that are giving me this experience, or is it me viewing the mountains and it being fed back to me? Now, I know
Mm.
that sounds odd, but the reason why I often contemplate that is what that talks to is an innate oneness in life, which is it's that same principle as if a tree falls in the forest and it makes a sound. If there's no one there, does it make a sound? And
Mm.
it's the same principle of the beholder has to view the beauty for the beauty to mean anything. So it's this unified relationship between the viewer and the viewed, which ultimately are one. Now, that will be the deeper spiritual dimension of it. But in principle, the point I'm making here is we might not like that language, might be too fanciful, too philosophical, but the experience is still real. Whether we're at a football game or looking at a mountain or whatever,
Mm.
we're melting into something. Something's taking us over. There's a oneness occurring, if you will. Now,
Is that what theism essentially offers us then, would you say?
well, I mean, again, there's two distinctions to make here because we could say yes, it is, but there's the intellect and there's the actual experience, and these are wildly different things. So, the intellect, and this is a big problem with trying to debate these issues. It's why atheists versus Christians very rarely gets into the meat of it because even if you're a Christian arguing against an atheist, it's all still intellect. Whereas I mean, this is again a problem with Jordan Peterson that I love Peterson, I think he's great, but it's all intellect. It's all talking about Christianity. It's all talking about what it is rather than the actual lived experience, which is what it really is. And then we can have our right, because the ideas are just reflections of what it really is. It's not its fundamental truth. And this, if you like, brings us back to this core issue of modernity and God and what these things mean. Because in modernity, we only really accept ideas. That's rationalism,
Mm.
post-revolution. That's the way we view the world. Everything is an idea. That's it. Everything is in the mind. If we can think it and it's rational, it's real. Of course, the traditional approach is, well, that's not really true. That's a dimension. But the traditional understanding is life is the real wisdom, or God is the real wisdom, whatever language you prefer, or more New Age language would be something like consciousness is the real driver of life, if you will, and something that you can, or at least depending on who you read and how they see it, a select few can align with. So we could say, prophets, the great seers of the great civilizations have these interactions and then they feed back their insights to the culture, the civilization. Obvious example would be, Moses or Christ or the Buddha or whatever. And they bring these deep realizations in, which become the foundations of the culture. If like they become the moral norms of the culture, that then underlie the way of life for everybody else. Now, that's moderated over time via the priestly figures, the spiritual figures, and so on, that teaches the why of life, if you will, and how we live life. So again, the way to probably describe this is there's differing levels to this, where some people will go right for the mystical experience. That's what I'm quite interested in. And that would be the melting of the self. It's essentially a much grander version than the guy singing on the stand, the football game.
Mm.
It's like that, but all the time. And your self somewhat melts into your surroundings. That's what they mean by oneness in the spiritual traditions. Now, I'm not claiming I'm at that state. I believe I've had mystical experiences that have showed me that state. But for most people, they come in and out of these states. And for some few, the great teachers may remain in that domain, if you will. But as I say, there are levels. So you'll go right down to these teachings essentially being really cheapened and watered down. And that's what the modern church is like. So, for
Yeah.
instance, you'll look at some teachings and just be like, this doesn't make any sense. It's just stupid. And the Dawkins and the Gervais and Stephen Fry, they'll just rip it to shreds because
Yeah,
they're
of
clever.
course.
And, basically it's easy pickings for them. But it's things like, that Moses asked the burning bush, who are you? I am that I am. It's just nonsense in modern language. But with the mystical understanding, again, I am that I am is the great spiritual realization that again, it goes back to that unity. What I see is what I am fundamentally. So again, it's how you understand these things in the broader context and what value, perhaps most importantly, they have in the role of a civilization, but also the role of us as individuals. And I don't want to imply on this that, this is for everybody. A lot of people just aren't interested in this, and that's fine. They don't have to be. But I think the point I would ideally make is we do need this dimension in our culture, in our civilizations, to give people a path to the transcendent, to keep a line of vitality going into our world, which offers people a deeper sense of meaning, something beyond themselves, which is real and holds us all together.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. You touched upon there the modern church, and it does seem to me like again, I don't know whether it's been deliberate or not, but in our culture, it's seen as very uncool. And you know, well, actually, do you know what? Let's go into it. Is that intentional? Do you think that there is an agenda to sort of undermine our spiritual tradition? Does it make us easier to control? Does it make us easier to conquer? I mean, just look what's happened to the modern church. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like it really represents Christianity. And so I could even ask you as well. A second question to that would be, what are some of the common misinterpretations, if you like, of Christianity? We're taught that it's a lot about universal love, indiscriminate love, and tolerance and all this sort of stuff. It seems kind of weak, but is that true Christianity? So yeah, first question is, is there a deliberate attempt? Is there an agenda here to sort of undermine our religious tradition? Um, and what was the second question? I can't remember now. Maybe just
Yeah,
start with
no,
that one.
I've wondered the second question. Is Christianity a bit feminine and weak?
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
that
yeah. What are the main, sort of misinterpretations of it, if you like? What are the things that most people believe about it which are not true, and what is it really all about?
Yeah, yeah. So again, I mean, very privileged you're asking me these questions. I should emphasize I'm not an authority on these issues, but I do have ideas on them, and I'm happy to speak on them. But there are many people out there who are also offering very important insights. But I think the first thing to say, is it on purpose? Is the undermining of the church on purpose? I would say in some senses, yes, but not in a grand sense, because in a grand sense, it's all part of the decline we mentioned at the top of the call.
Mm.
Once your tradition starts to dissipate, it will let in all sorts of alien forces, like woke ideology is one. It's a metastasization of Christian love and is turned back on the church, turned back on Western civilization and eaten it apart. So the first thing really is men moving away from the tradition. As you may well know from my channel, I believe the role of men is to create wise boundaries, not too tyrannical, but not too loose either. And then guard those over time, guard those bricks of tradition. That largely started to fall apart. Some argue, with Blair, some argue with the end of the Second World War, with all the brutality the European men saw. Some argue, before that with the First World War, and some even, with the French Revolution, and some even before that. So it depends where you want to draw the line. But personally, I think, that they're all examples of declining culture. But you can really see something shift around the end of the Second World War, where I think many men were beaten up. I think they got tired of the big ideas, religion, and that gave birth to the 60s, which again, on the surface was incredible, explosion of power, love, quote unquote, freedom, and all that sort of stuff. But in time, it's turned, so once you destroy the tradition, it's fun for a bit, but then it sort of becomes meaningless. It's like modern art, I don't know if you know Jackson Pollock, but he has these paintings and it's just like squiggles everywhere. And he did those in the 50s, I think. Now,
I don't know that
again,
particular offender, but I'm not familiar with many other modern quote unquote artists. And Christ, I mean,
yeah, some of it's bad. Well, this is the point though, because even I, who's more of a traditionalist, can argue that, I can understand what Pollock's trying to do. It was the time of exploring the unconscious. That's what the squiggly lines were about. He's essentially saying, artistic forms have changed, complexities entered the space. And that's clever. All right, fine. You've done it once, it's clever. But once it's done, you can't go back to the tradition. And now all we've just opened up to more and more weirdness, which is essentially just about yourself. I mean, I've tried to find it for my channel for years, and I can't find the clip, but I remember years ago listening to an interview with Tracy M, the artist in
The
the
dirty
UK.
mattress on the floor with a used condom or something.
Exactly, exactly. And I remember someone, like some interview asking her, like, well, what if someone says that this isn't art? And she said, I won't drop the F-bomb if this offends wherever we publish this, but she said it's art because I effing say it's art. And I was like, that's modernity. Like
Mm.
that's how you
Yeah.
think. It's me. It's everything's about me. It's my interpretation. There
Yeah.
is no
It's my life
interpretation.
experience.
Exactly. Exactly. It's all the modern woke stuff just a little bit before, but that was the same ideology underpinning it.
So
And
do you
again,
think then? Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. Go on.
no, go on, go on.
I was just going to say, do you think really then that like, Christianity has basically just been just another victim of the modern sort of zeitgeist, the philosophical zeitgeist, I suppose. Has it just been swallowed up along with everything else?
Well,
Is it just part of the sort of tapestry of, decay that we've witnessed?
well, I'd say on the surface it is, yeah. I mean, I'd say, true Christianity, true Christ can't be eradicated because it's in the spirit. But on the surface, yes, yes, we've seen this. Well, to be honest, what it is, I don't think it's necessarily been destroyed. I think what it is it's been gutted out. And because of the nature of the era, the materialism, the rationalism, and so on, it's been re-inflated with the ideology of the age. And
Mm,
this leads to the next question you had, which is, we've moved away from the priest, the warrior archetype, the king, and we've come into the era, if you like, of the mass man, something like that. Equality and diversity, tolerance, rationalism, and that's essentially the operating model of the church now. So if you think about how the mainstream church tends to emphasize Jesus, he's seen as quite a feminine hippie guy,
mm,
now in the culture. That's how we view him.
mm.
And we emphasize those aspects of him. And you'll see this, of course, everywhere. Oh, Jesus, never married, and oh, henceforth he must have been the first trans person. And we'll see these sorts of claims, or Jesus was gay, or whatever, and all these
Yeah.
sorts of things will start cropping up.
Well,
And that's the extreme version. But even in the softer versions, like I went to a church not so long ago, and I was looking for a more conservative church. That tends to be what I believe. So I just come out straight up and say it. So I said, look, I'm more traditional. I like hymns, I like traditional preaching. What's the energy at this church? And this, pastor said to me, uh, well, we do like a traditional line ourselves, but we don't hate anybody or anything. We're very welcoming. And I thought that response is modernity, and that shows what's happened to the church. They're frightened, and I don't blame them for this, but they're frightened to say, no, we actually do hold to a traditional teaching because they
mm.
might just get ripped apart. They don't know who I am. Maybe I'm from the Guardian or something, and I'm going to write,
Gonna
hateful,
do a big hit piece on your
hateful.
local church.
Exactly, exactly. And so they're very careful. And again, everything to do with Christianity is the weak side of Christ, the feminine side of Christ is overemphasized. That is a real dimension to Christ. Like he is completely loving.
Mm.
There is universal love and compassion there, but we ignore the masculine side of Christ. And really you have to go and read the Gospels to see that. The first time I read the Gospels myself, I was like, whoa, this guy can actually be pretty hardcore. He'll tell
Mm.
you very directly if you're sinning. He gets the whip out in the temple. So, he does have that side to him. And you can chart this even right back to even Nietzsche. Nietzsche's making these same criticisms, really, that Christianity's weak years ago, years ago. But again, it's worth remembering that Nietzsche came on the back of, well, post-French Revolution, the era of ideology, all that sort of stuff. He didn't come before, and that I would argue is that the very reason he didn't become before is before that we had a traditional model. After that, things started to open up, if that makes sense.
Richard, could you give us some examples? I don't know if you can think of any off the top of your head, but this whole idea that we've been fed about Christ, has been very sort of, feminine and, sort of all those typical sort of traits that you'd associate with femininity and the female temperament, of sort of, excessive empathy, tolerance and love, but not so much the masculine side. Are there some examples maybe of just like how, because I really don't know, but it seems to me like if you wanted to undermine it, if there was an agenda, or if it's just accidental and again it's just been swallowed up by the culture, it seems to me that sort of feminizing him would be it would definitely repel people. It would make the religion seem weak. So, what are some of the sort of misinterpretations there, if you like, or how is Christ misrepresented in the modern culture?
When you say examples, do you mean how he's misrepresented in the culture or examples of him behaving in a more masculine manner?
Yeah, both, definitely the latter. What sort of things does he, what sort of example does he really set? Is it really this idea that we've been fed that he's just sort of like a, free love hippie,
Yeah,
who
yeah.
doesn't believe in, redemption or anything like this, or, this idea that, people sort of reap what they sow and an eye for an eye and all this kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I mean, I think I probably won't have to go too far into the examples of him being treated like a hippie because they're just everywhere in this day and age. And for most of us, it's our collective image of Jesus. Even if
Mm.
you ask an atheist, what do you think of Jesus? They might be like, oh, it's all made up. But he said, yeah, but what do you think of him personally? And they'd be like, yeah, he seems all right. Seems like a nice guy. And because that's the way that we're taught about him from school and so on. And again, it's not that this understanding of Jesus as this welcoming, kind, compassionate person is wrong, but it's just a dimension of his personality. It's not the whole of what Jesus was. And of course, the obvious example of Christ in his warrior energy, if you will, is the cross. I mean, facing utter brutality. He didn't have to face that. And even says in the Garden of Gethsemane, can this cup be taken from me? Can I avoid this incredible torture I'm going to go through? I know it's a pop culture example and all that, but if you want a rough idea, Mel Gibson's Passion of the
William
Christ.
Wallace.
It's
I thought you were going to
sorry.
say I thought you were going to say William Wallace before he's hanged
No,
and drawn
not what he
in
wants.
the
But it's, again,
Braveheart.
that would be a Christ metaphor, though.
Yeah.
That's why that movie is moving because it's
Mm.
riffing on the Christ allegory. But again, it's a similar thing, and it was brutal. What Christ went through, and his death was brutal. But it's the willingness to face it for the good of the whole. That's the heroic masculine, if you will. He could have he had all the power he wanted to try and to overcome that if he wanted to, but there was and again, this is where I think the Nietzschean misreading's wrong. It's this idea that, oh, you're weak and you're giving in and you're letting yourself be beaten. No, it's not that at all. He's allowing himself to face this incredible cruelty for the good of the whole, to
Mm.
transcend the physical dimension into the broader, if you like, enlightened dimension of life, if you will, to show us men the path and the way through. Now, that doesn't mean that we just say, if you're in a fight, oh, I hold my hands up and turn the other cheek. This is a misreading. You can defend yourself. Of course you can. It's a spiritual message. It's a spiritual message to overcome the suffering of life, or at least endure the suffering of life, which again is the classic masculine thing to do. As
Mm.
fathers, as leaders, as men, we're going to have to endure suffering. If we don't and we reject it, we will become those bitter people who really struggle with life, who are poisoned by inner demons. And I know because I was there in my own 20s. It's why I'm really interested in this stuff is it really works. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, but my life did change. You think, okay, this isn't just stories. This is real. It's
Mm.
real stuff, and there's real advice that you're just not going to get from a counselor, a therapist, or whatever. There's real spiritual content here. So that would be the most obvious example. But then there's countless other examples, where he tells a rich man to sell his possessions, very direct talk to him. The reason he's doing that, again, socialists think, oh, that means Christ is against people having wealth. That's not the point in my eyes. He's saying it to the rich man because the rich man's got lost in his riches. So if
Mm.
you value something in a worldly sense, you're going to get lost in that. And it's going to destroy you.
Yeah,
So
there's
Christ is challenging him to give up what is most valuable to him, in order to grow spiritually and personally.
there's
Which
something
again,
in. Oh, sorry, Richard. I was
So,
going to say there's in the New Testament. There's a passage that just came to mind when you said that, which I really liked, which was I'll probably misquote here, but it's something like, "What is a man profited if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul?" I think that's very
exactly.
much the message there, isn't it?
Yeah, precisely. And again, that's also, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, what the West has forgotten en masse. It's fine to be ambitious. It's fine to want to try and earn some money, to be successful, to try and bring something awesome into the world, to create jobs, to have a nice big house for your family and your kids. That's all awesome.
Mm.
But when it goes beyond that and it just becomes solely about, if you like, the egocentric chasing of pleasures and gold trinkets and status and success, we're sort of losing something then. And I think we've veered into that territory. And then everything becomes about that. Everything becomes material.
Mm.
But just quickly, if you don't mind, two other examples that spring to mind. I really like
No,
talking about
please.
people, but there's a really nice parable where Christ finds this madman in the caves, and it's like labyrinthian caves, and this guy's gone nuts. He's nude. He bangs a rock, against another rock and sharpens it, and just yells and screams. And I think he's called Legion or something like that because there's a legion of people in him, a legion of demons inside of him, and everyone's terrified of this guy. But Christ just goes straight into the caves, and of course, Christ immediately the demons know who Christ is. He casts the demons out, and this guy finds his sanity again. But the reason I really love this story is because it speaks so well to modernity, which is we're so obsessed with the subconscious and the conscious and Freudianism and psychological ideas of healing. But there's something really beautiful in there about the transcendent healing, which we don't really allow in this day and age. Even the church doesn't tend to engage in it too much. Now, it's easy to misunderstand this. It's easy to fall into New Age nonsense, but there is something in there which I think is very profound. And I think I've experienced in my own small way, which comes with, once we realize that we're not half of these identities that we think we are in our mind, the short-tempered person, the person who's got this hang up over this thing, this anxiety we've had since we were 14, we start to realize, oh, I'm deeper than all these things. And that, if you like, is where you can touch your true soul and you can, quote unquote, be saved.
Mm.
And just finally, the example of the temple as well. This is one I'm very fond of. Christ goes into the temple and well, there are money changes in there, and Christ again says, this a temple is a spiritual domain. It's not a place for money changing, and essentially chases them all out with a whip. Now that's again, it's very forceful masculine behavior, if you like. It's righteous anger,
Mm.
uh, in a sense, which again is not some hippie Christ figure that we're given in the church. But again, I would say fundamentally, just even reading the Gospels and coming across, especially the Beatitudes, you will see just a different side to Christ that we just don't get. Deeply loving, but deeply direct as well.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, no, that is awesome stuff. Thanks so much for that, Richard. Yeah, really, really illuminating. I want to speak a little bit about our ancestors as well, and our own people, because I think this is again something that seems to have been totally sort of dismissed by the modern culture. With this sort of idea that we're all the same, and that culture doesn't matter, or at least culture in this country doesn't matter. Other people's cultures, they're sort of sacrosanct, but ours is, you know, uh, can be undermined with no problem at all, and totally discredited and lied about and misrepresented. But from this conversation, I think we both think there is something in that, in our own people, in a sense of belonging, and in our ancestry. Something that's become more important to me over the last couple of years is this idea of sort of like my bloodline, my history, my ancestors. And I think this love, this collective love that we sort of spoke about earlier in the call, I think that really shows with some of the uh, things throughout history that clearly demonstrate there was that sense of living for something bigger than yourself and living for future generations as well. And when I now look at especially churches and cathedrals, and there's some ones that I really like that sort of spring to mind, which is my favorite's probably York Minster. And I remember looking up the history of that a couple of years ago, and it took several hundred years to finish building. And the people who would have built that building would have known that they would never see it finished. And there's many other beautiful cathedrals in this country and beautiful buildings in general, but a lot of places of worship. This Salisbury Cathedral and is it Winchester? I think also has a very nice one. And I've seen these and just thought, there's something in that is special that we've lost today. And it strikes me that there's something in that is a sense of love for your own people and for future generations. I think it's an old Chinese proverb that says something like, a good society is one in which men plant trees in whose shade they'll never sit, something like that. I mean, imagine setting out to build one of these cathedrals, knowing that it's going to take 250 years and knowing that you're never going to see the finished project, but doing it anyway because you love your people so much. And it just seems to me like we've completely lost that. And, it's just that kind of culture to live in just seems unimaginable for us today. We can barely think about, anything beyond ourselves. Does that make us happier? Did people build those great cathedrals out of love for their people and for future generations? Or were they just doing it because they were brainwashed by the church, as a lot of people would think these days, or forced to by the church? Or is it a sort of blend of the two or something else?
Yeah, I mean, look, I dare say, I don't know, would every workman who was working on that church be deeply embedded with the tradition? Maybe, maybe not. I couldn't quite say with complete certainty, but they were built for some reason. And like you say, these buildings were built with many people knowing and the architects knowing they'd never see them, when they were completed and finished. And it does beg the question again, why? Why would you do it? Well, the answer is because you're building something which is bigger than yourself, which points to something beyond your life. And you can understand that in different ways, whether you understand it in the mystical sense of your giving a part of your life to serve in love for the rest of your people or God or whatever it would be, whether you believe in a more biblical understanding of you will go to heaven afterwards or something like that, which you could say orients your behavior down here on earth. That would be a sort of Jordan Peterson reading, I guess. Or
Mm.
even if it's just something like you say, it's about your people and just doing something for the group, the tribe. There are varying levels of why people did these things. But again, I think the biggest issue perhaps with all of this is why we don't do that today. I mean, the buildings that we build today are built for utilitarian purposes.
Completely.
If
Form
we
follows
if
function type thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it was Roger Scruton made a good point about, it's only really beauty that lasts. And
Mm.
again, why don't we care about that today? We care more about buildings that look impressive, authoritative, efficient, these sorts of things. But will they really last like the old buildings will? It's like I often say, people visit Europe, they visit London and Paris and Rome and so on to see the old buildings. That's
Mm.
why people are coming, that they want to see the heart of the tradition ultimately. So,
Yeah.
sorry, go on.
No, 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 no. Please carry on, Richard. If there's anything else
No,
you
so,
want to
yeah, I
add.
mean, yeah, so I think in this day and age, again, it comes back to this question of what we're living for and why. And there probably is something to be said as well about you can put on rose-tinted spectacles and see the past in a certain light and ignore the hardships and the brutalities, and that's true. And we can ignore some of the niceties we have today. But I think what I'm getting at is there's this spiritual essence in there, which is something like facing the hardship now to gain the spiritual growth
Mm.
versus experiencing everything now and enjoying it and having fun, but paying down the line. And it seems to me that in the more modern world, we're taking that latter approach with lots of things. And it's meaning, okay, we get this short-termism, but in the long run, things are just getting worse and worse. A perfect example is the government. I mean, was it Dominic Cummings who said recently? I think we all knew this anyway, but he said,
He said it's all
look,
a
government,
facade. He said it's all theatre and that it's all fake. I think
exactly.
Westminster,
Yeah, exactly. And I think he also said something like, governments think in terms of what's going to impress the
the
public
election
now, but
cycle. Yeah.
especially yeah, exactly, what's going to win the next election cycle. So they don't give a shit about the long run. They don't care about what's going to happen in 25, 30 years. Again, that's mass immigration. Again, like I've said, I'm not fundamentally opposed to immigration if the numbers are small and if the people integrate. But that
Mm.
argument's long gone. That went, in John Major's era, and obviously Tony Blair ramped it up even more. But the point I'm getting at is, we've lost touch with a nation and leaders and people who think about us as a people. And again, I think there's probably something to be said for why that is. I can rattle on about it if you want, but I don't want to talk on for too long.
Mm. Yeah, no, Rich, that's awesome. I mean, I did want to speak a little bit about well, I had some sort of quick questions that I think we could maybe take us through to the end of the call, which
Sure.
is very much on this theme. But I thought about we spoke about at the beginning of the call, this sort of cycles of civilizations, if you like, and I'm sure there's been lots of ups and downs, and we've had peaks at different times, and it hasn't been sort of like since this country was formed, it hasn't just been like up and then down. There's been lots of ups and downs throughout that period. But talking about this sort of trajectory of the country, when do you think the rot set in this country? When was you actually spoke about this a little bit earlier in the call? You spoke about after World War II. You spoke about I think the early noughties and the Blair era and that sort of thing. But taking it back, maybe just to look at like since 1900, let's say. In fact, I tell you what, let's do the first one. So what do you reckon is the best decade in this country since 1900 to live in this country?
That's a good question. I mean, again, in material terms, in spiritual terms, in communitarian terms, what do you think?
Add it all up. I mean, the best time to be alive in this, not just to experience one day, but to be in your prime and living in Britain.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably say the boomers to the Gen Xers had it best. Simply because they experienced, the freedom and the free love of the 60s, the economic boom of Thatcherism, and now they've been able to move into houses and sell them for millions or million. So I'd say they probably experienced the best in material terms while having a foundation in the tradition of their parents, the war generation. So I'd
Yes.
say they gave them those solid values. And so, yeah, they've been lucky enough to experience it all from the solid values to the sort of conveniences of modernity. So I'd probably say them.
So in terms of decade, then I'm gonna guess you're probably aiming at like sort of 80s, 90s time.
Yeah, yeah, it's hard to pin it down exactly, but yeah, 60s to 90s, something like that. I mean, yes, probably around then, and take your pick amongst them. I mean, 70s, obviously, Britain was dying economically. So 60s, 80s, arguably 90s, something like that, probably.
Okay, and when do you think that the sort of the rot set in? Or when was the peak, and when did it start going downhill? So what was the sort of highest point throughout all of our history, maybe even since the Romans left in 400 AD or whatever it was? What was sort of the peak of you know British civilization or Britain as a whole?
Yeah, again, it probably depend upon different things, such as, are we talking spiritually, materially, culturally, and so on. So I think, there are probably different answers for each of those.
Yeah, I suppose when yeah, of course. I don't mean economically, of course. I mean when would we have been happiest, I suppose, is the best way to put it. When would people have been happiness? Because of course, that's what it comes down to, really, at the end of the day. It's like, we want to have good lives. And I don't think that what makes us happy is all this material wealth. As much as, again, I don't think it's a bad thing. It can facilitate our lives. But, life's good when we have certain values. I, a bit like you, obviously lean towards more of the sort of traditional values and conservative values. I think it makes for a good society to live in. And I think it brings with it economic prosperity as well. But obviously the economic side and the social, cultural side are separate. But, when would people have been the happiest? Again, obviously, it's a bit of a test of knowledge of history because we really don't know what the Dark Ages was like, as they're called. We don't know that much about that period, but we know a lot from sort of 11th, 12th century on, I suppose. And
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, the thing is, I dare say, in terms of religious ecstasy, connection with the tradition, these sorts of things, it probably would be going back to the Dark Ages. I
mm,
dare say there was an organization to society there where the king was semi-divine, where, your life really was live for God, where a lot of the beautiful churches and monasteries were built. I'm sure that was religiously, probably a time of yeah, like I say, almost ecstatic experience in certain pockets, but then at the same time, you can't ignore the scale of human suffering at this point as well, the average age of death and so on. So again,
Mm,
they're different things, and I suppose it's an interesting question because it kind of makes you think very coldly about the issues we face today. Because again, we have to be thankful to our ancestors for what they gave us. The level of well-being, the especially Britain. I mean, the level of inventions that we've given our country, but also the world. I mean, just so many things that we've created. So in a sense, we have to be thankful for all that. But I guess the point I'm trying to get at is it's the combination of the two that I suppose we ultimately need to be aiming for and have the wisdom to manage, where we have, if you like, this standard of well-being and health, but it's combined with the traditional values. And that's the trick, for humanity to really try and find that medium between. Because again, it tends to be once we have great material wealth and advances, we
mm,
forget the basics that got us there,
yeah, of course.
even the more important factors of life as well, the deeper side of life. Sorry, you were about to say something.
Yeah, no, no, no. Please, sorry, carry on, Richard.
Yeah, and then vice versa, you could say, there's a counter case to that in the sense of in the Dark Ages, yeah, there may have been a deeper connection, but at the same time, there's an a too stringent, too tyrannical hold, if you like, on what can and can't be said. So if I suppose there is that happy medium to be found in the middle, if human beings can ever truly find it. But I suppose if you think dialectically, it's not impossible for a renewed civilization to try and find that model.
I suppose this is why it's so important that we have traditions, that we respect them, and that we pass them down. And of course, like, as you basically just described, when things become so good, so comfortable, we become so rich, that's when we become decadent and we lose the need for sort of any spirituality. So how do we, again, this is a massive question. We're not going to have time to explore it too deeply, but how do we keep that going? How do we keep the sort of the correct social order, if you like, and those traditions? And obviously we need strong leaders for that, and we need strong institutions, and we need strong families. But when there's no need for all this stuff, how do we compel people to carry on and preserve our traditions? And these, I mean, again, social orders is a slightly different thing, but of course, I'm thinking of like the family being strong and having a strong father, and I'm thinking about local communities and respect for your elders, and politicians that actually care about the country and stuff like that. How do we manage to live in a really comfortable world where we don't really feel the need for a more spiritual dimension to our life? Um,
Yeah. It's a very good question, and again, like I think there's a very simple answer to it in that you can't convince anybody of this. You have to experience it yourself. And right now, the West is going to hit the wall if it isn't already hitting the wall because we've forgotten these things. And it's the only way to wake people up to these truths. If you try and
mm,
convince someone, they'll just argue back because, again, it's just an ego position arguing with an ego position. But when enough people experience it, which is, I think, is what's happening now, which may well be why there's been some interest in channels like mine and some of the thinkers who might be more traditionalist or Christian or religious or whatever, it's because people are sensing this. Like I said at the beginning, whatever walk of life, people sense that something's dying and we're losing something, that the country's not in a good way. And again, it's almost like we have to go through that for enough people to realize what we've lost
mm.
and what the bricks of tradition actually meant. So again, I mean, it's a point I meant to make earlier. But I didn't want to rattle on too long. But I think it is relevant in that, we are in just a completely different moral and metaphysical universe at the moment. And a lot of people are speaking about this, especially on the online right. And I think it's really important, which is we've been living in a post-World War II mentality since 1945. And this is why I think when you were speaking earlier about recognizing these deeper things, many people are starting to question some of the truths that we imbibed after World War II. Namely, if you recognize, as you called it earlier, bloodline or you're part of a group, oh my God, you're Hitler. That's why everyone's been terrified to talk about it. But more and more people are thinking, well, hang on, that's not the case because we keep celebrating all of these groups from abroad and denying our own background. And again, this is why this conversation around Englishness has come up recently in the media. And
Yeah. Oh, in a
that's a
big way. It's amazing, really.
it's amazing, yeah, like mainstream politicians, mainstream journalists saying, yeah, do you know what? Actually, it is all right to be English. Now, to
Mm.
someone who doesn't understand England or Europe, that would be crazy. Yeah, but you're just English. Like, what's the problem with that? But it's such a controversial thing to say historically. Like, no, the English are a group, a unique group, because it
Mm.
immediately in the post-World War II context means, oh, all of a sudden you love Hitler, you want everyone to die, you hate other groups. And of course, it's nonsense. It's nonsense.
Mm.
But people are, because of mass migration, because we're losing our tradition, starting to think alongside those lines. And again, this is probably the evidence of a breakdown because we didn't have to consider these things before because, Brits were 95% or the English were 95% of England. No one was attacking the culture on a daily basis. So they just didn't really matter. Well, all of
Mm.
a sudden they do matter. And it's meaning that people question, if you like, the moral universe we live in. And I think the answer to that it's to go back to a richer understanding of a tradition and who we are, rooted fundamentally in what I would call love. And as you probably know, I don't mean like soppy American Hollywood love. I mean, again, this beyond yourself. We're bigger than just the individual, and our lives should speak to that individual. Sorry, speak to that sense of collectiveness or identification, which is bigger than the small self. So in essence, what I'm saying is I think we can't convince anybody, but people are being convinced every day themselves because they notice what's
Mm.
going on. And they notice that we are at the end of this, if you like, cycle that we're stuck in, really.
Yeah, and I suppose that's why I think, you said before that you um would almost prefer the decline to be accelerated, really, so that we can bottom out, culturally, socially, economically sooner, and then start to rebuild something, in the wake of everything that's collapsed. And I wonder then, because again, I don't know if you listened to the interview with David Betts, this academic from I think it's King's College London, with Louise Perry interviewing him, and it's about the sort of coming civil war, his predictions for a civil war. And he talked a lot about the decline of this country in many different ways, and how basically we're ripe for some kind of civil unrest and that sort of stuff. And we're already seeing sort of indications that things might go that way, with quite a lot of rioting and people chopping down ULEZ cameras and, this sort of stuff. Even some other interesting things going on, like someone hacked into one of the rail network's Wi-Fi systems the other day and sent out a message, this sort of a quote unquote right wing thing. But so I think there's a lot of stuff going on, these little sort of splinter groups doing things behind the scenes. But then of course there's stuff that's, very much out in the open. But yeah, I just wonder what you think, because I know you've said before that in a way you kind of welcome this Labour government purely purely on the basis that, very well might speed up the decline and therefore get us closer to something better to emerge, in the ashes, if you like, sooner. So I wonder what your predictions are for when we bottom out. This guy, David Betts, he was saying that he thinks that something is going to really kick off, in the next within 5 years, which is interesting because that sort of coincides quite neatly with this Labour government's term. And I think, but you've also said in the past that you think it might be much longer than that. So I wonder what your kind of view is on that. When are we going to bottom out? When are we going to see the worst, or are we already there?
Yeah, yeah, good question. I mean, I think the first thing to say is I have seen this interviews going viral everywhere, isn't it? And I think he's done another one recently as well. I haven't actually watched them yet myself. And again, I think it's hard to put your finger on exactly when we're going to see a shift. Because, but look, personally speaking, I'm happy to let go to the tradition, let go to God. It will happen how it's going to happen. Best thing we can do is get prepared spiritually, personally, understand our tradition, be ready to build something meaningful that we can draw on the wisdom of the past, so we can keep moving and get moving quickly, and even welcome this process to an extent. However, when will we start to see these things? Like, personally speaking, I think 5 years is a bit premature, but I do get what he's saying because, with all the news about reform recently, for anyone listening to this, we've just had the news that reform are getting in arguments. Rupert Lowe's been kicked out or something like that. And it shows that,
Bullying,
look,
apparently.
yeah, yeah, a reform in any position to actually, lead, form a government. And of course, this is concerning for people because they think, hang on a minute, if Reform can't sort themselves out, we're just stuck with Keir Starmer or the Tories, which are just a complete joke. So we really are screwed. And you can understand with that in the back of people's minds, that's worrying. Like that is really worrying when you think we genuinely don't have an alternative now. Now, look, personally speaking, I don't think we have an alternative anyway. I don't think reform can do that much. I think it's like Trump in America. They can slow things down, they can improve things for the short term. But this idea of, they'll get in, they'll stop the illegals, and then we'll just have this sort of 90s libertarianism, colorblind politics. Look, the world has moved on. Like it's better than what we've got, don't get me wrong, way better. But
Mm,
still, it's not going to fundamentally address the core fault lines that the West and the UK is suffering from. The only way that is going to be addressed is, again, when we have this sort of rebirth, this reawakening of our civilization. And to me, that will take longer than 5 years because things are going to have to start splitting apart first. And like I say, then people are going to have to feel the pinch, feel the pain, realize, if you like, the outcomes of the ideas, not intellectually, but really feel it. And then I think intuitively, more and more people will be like, okay, look, we've got something wrong. We need to reawaken something here. And when I say reawaken, it doesn't just simply mean, going back to church and just everything becomes about like, you know, endless prayers and and things like that. It will be, I
Gregorian
personally
chanting.
think, exactly. I personally think there will be reawakenings in ways that we just can't fathom or understand right now, because that's how history works. Maybe there'll be new dimensions of our understanding of Christianity and what it means. Maybe there'll be new understandings of who we are as a people. Maybe there'll even be new geographical borders. I know
Mm,
these things sound wild, but that is consistent with human history. This is just what happens when things start to fall apart. And as I've said before, I know it sounds a bit of a dire prediction, but I personally think balkanization will happen. I think we're already in a pre-balkanized state. It's just waiting for it to officially happen. How long before the Muslims join together and say, well, do you know what? You don't serve us. We care about Palestine. We care about the Muslim world. We don't want to pay usury because, Muhammad said not to, all that sort of stuff. Or we
mm,
don't agree with usury, sorry. So, and in a way you have to think, well, fair enough, because that's their tradition. That's the way they think. It's only the liberal ideology that tells us they don't. So once things like that start happening and the numbers are just more and more people are coming in, birth rates are going down, you're thinking, look, this will volcanize. And
mm,
then if I'm honest, I think the centers of power will stay the same, like London and Manchester, because they're connected to the global economy, and they'll have a lot of security and be protected because finance runs through there, big media, big sports, all these sorts of things. But outside of that, it will get increasingly balkanized.
mm,
And even, I think, like I say, there'll be a question of what is England anymore. Maybe there'll be pockets of it. But this
mm,
almost has to happen, I think, for there to be a sort of a realization and rebirth down the line, which will be bigger than just England, bigger than UK. In my eyes, it has to be Europe wide, because we have to think, look, we are the people who've been fortunate enough to be gifted Western culture, and it's our duty to maintain it. And at the moment, we don't even think like that. We don't even
no.
think in
We
those
don't
terms.
recognize
We
how
don't
great it
recognize
is what's been
it.
passed down to us.
Exactly. We're so disrespectful. We just think, whatever. Go out, get pissed at
Mm,
the weekend, bang a load of chicks, watch the football. That's life. We don't
mm,
think like, hang on, this is ours. It comes from our ancestors. It's our duty to take care of it and try and pass it on. But that will reawaken. But personally, I think that that's going to be quite a bit down the road yet. I think that's probably going to be a few decades before we're there. I think there's going to be lots going on before that. But for that real sense of rebirth and realization, I think it may take a bit longer than that.
Okay. Richard, you got time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure,
So
sure.
just on that, I know you said maybe a few decades and stuff, but what about this idea of, I mean, again, civil war is probably pretty a vague term, but you know, some close approximation of civil war. You talked about balkanization there, but I'm talking about sort of civil unrest, civil disobedience, segregation, balkanization, violence, some close approximation of civil war. Do you think that is possible in the next 5 to 10 years, or even less? Do you think it's a likelihood that we'll see
Well,
something
yeah,
like that?
yeah, no, I do. I mean, the first thing, of course, to say as well, I think obviously I speak for both of us here in Keir Starmer's Britain that we're not promoting any form of violence, and I wouldn't promote riots or anything like that.
Absolutely, we want to try and avoid it if possible, but it's some people think this is an inevitability that we have to prepare
Exactly.
for.
Yeah.
I think what's a shame is that, of course, a lot of this could have been avoided if it wasn't for our treacherous politicians who really done
Agreed.
so
Yeah.
much to
Agreed.
kind of make this place fertile for that kind of thing. They have created the conditions that have made this a likelihood. People like us, I think, really hope this doesn't happen, but it seems like it's something that we can't ignore the possibility of.
Yeah, no, I think that's bang on. I'd go with that. I just think it's important for us to state because this is the world we're living in now.
Mm,
Where it's we're in an effective, would-be tyranny where you have to be really clear. Otherwise, who knows? So,
mm,
like I say, for both of us, not promoting any form of violence, don't recommend anyone engage in anything like that. But could it happen? Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we could all. I mean, I think the riots that we had last summer, I didn't expect them to be as bad as they were, but I wasn't surprised to see them.
mm,
I wasn't surprised because it's the working class, isn't it? They've been forgotten, betrayed, no one represents them, and they just feel it's just waiting to explode. Now, what was interesting about it is how heavy Keir Starmer and the judiciary were on the rioters. Now, again, I didn't
mm,
agree with the riots. I said that at the time, no point in doing it. But it's very telling, when you have all sorts of people getting off for you know, severe crimes with a slap on the wrist. And then you have people who sent tweets getting sent to jail for 2, 3 years. I
mm.
mean, it's crazy, but you can see why they're doing it. They know that this is a threat, and they're trying to really come down hard on it because we don't even have any jail spaces. But still, they're removing actual criminals to put in people who've sent tweets. And
Mm.
again, it's because they know things are not good, and
What's
people are ready to blow.
What's interesting now is that, what would have been considered, sort of fringe conspiracy theories a few years ago, this suggestion that there's some kind of two-tier justice system and two-tier policing. That's now a completely accepted mainstream view. It really isn't out there at all. I mean, this is very, very normal. Most people believe this now. And who would have thought that 5 or 10 years ago? It seems to me like this has all accelerated very, very quickly, which is what makes me think that, especially listening to this interview yesterday with David Betts, that, it's something we are hastening towards that kind of situation.
Yeah, well, quite. I mean, again, I haven't seen the interview, but it sounds all quite logical. But again, you just think we have disparate groups who aren't being spoken to. And again, this is another really important dimension, which I think has been underlying what we're talking about. And I do speak a bit about on the channel. Every nation, people within a nation, they all live off a story. And it goes back to this, Dawkins thing again. It's easy to laugh at religions, it's easy to laugh at mythologies, but the role they play is they tell us a story about what life is and who we are.
Mm,
I think, was it Evola, the traditionalist thinker, who said something like myths are more important than facts? I
mm,
think that's what he was talking to. Like these scientific facts are great, they're incredible what we can achieve with this knowledge. But when it comes to the meaning of life, uniting people, we need a story. And again, it goes back. The Second World War post Second World War narrative was a story many people bought into. But now it's not making sense because it's something like, well, Churchill fought Hitler so we can have pride marches and mass immigration. And a lot of
mm,
people think, hang on a minute, is that what it was all about? And it makes you question the narrative. But of course, when it comes to what we've got going on in the country now, and you see this when you speak to someone on the left or whatever, they're living by a completely different story. And then you times that by 50 and you understand what modern Britain is like. The Muslims are living by a different story. The Christians are, the indigenous Brits are, the lefties are living by a different story. And again, there are many more groups like that. And you start thinking, well, how does that create any unity? How does that create people who think alike? And of course, the only thing they can say is, oh, well, Britain is actually about tolerance and diversity and inclusion. You think,
Mm,
well, is that all you've got? Like, is that it? The same thing that all of the globalist nations say. So, when you understand the value of myth and story and how it unites people, and how historically, maybe despite not having the material stuff, we did have a story that united us, you can see why things are just heating up, and
mm.
why we are just getting flashpoints all over the place. And like you say, I think perfectly correctly, this isn't us who set this up. We didn't set this situation up. The mainstream act like you've just got to get on board with our ideology, and if you don't, you're evil. But the thing is, they've created this quote unquote multicultural country where everyone's telling themselves a different story.
Mm.
And it creates a mess, which unfortunately will lead to enmity.
And I think we can also point out as well at this point that people like, again, I think you'd agree that I love the idea of different cultures around the world. Absolutely love it. I think it's fascinating that people have these different cultures with different values, different ways of living. I mean, even the subtlest of things. Simon Webb spoke about this recently. The subtle differences and sometimes not so subtle differences between different groups in the way that they interact, the values that they have, the things they believe. I think it's all wonderful, but this idea of multiculturalism, the term multiculturalism, I've said for probably about a decade now that I find it to be an oxymoron because far from being the celebration of many different distinct cultures, it's actually it's the promotion of a blending together of these cultures, which actually waters them all down and makes them a weaker, sort of adulterated version of their true selves. I don't think it's actually what we witness in this country with multiculturalism, these little different groups, if you like, they're not accurate representations of what their original culture was like. And they've adapted to our ways and we've adapted to their ways. And I rather find it sad because everyone's losing their identity at the same time in this sort of, this sort of melting pot, if you like, where all the cultures are blended together. And it creates a sort of homogeneity, a sort of blandness, if you like. So, that's a sort of a cultural point, if you like. But it seems to me like it's a real shame to have every country no longer recognizable and no longer distinct. I like the idea of going to Japan and celebrating, or not, well, not celebrating, but exploring and learning about Japanese culture, going to these other countries and saying, God, this is how you live, this is what you believe. They're absolutely fascinating. Then come back to your own country and there's all that familiarity there. It doesn't seem to me that to feel the things that I've just sort of expressed there. It doesn't seem to me that that could really be construed in any way as hateful. In fact, if anything, it actually seems to be that, people who say such things are actually celebrating different cultures. They truly desire multiculturalism, a world made up of totally different cultures and ways of living and religions and with different customs and mythos and everything. That's true multiculturalism. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. And I promise I only have one more question after this.
Yeah, well, precisely. I mean, this is the irony, isn't it, about actually being pro-diversity, but just not diversity in one unique country. I like the
Mm,
diversity of the world. That's great.
mm,
Like you say, Japan is awesome. Mexico's great. That's
mm,
cool. And you want to ideally allow those cultures and peoples to maintain their sacred culture, their sacred traditions. It belongs to them. And I don't wish to destroy it in any way. In fact, I wish for it to stay alive and thrive for every peoples around the world.
mm,
But it speaks to this core issue, which is, look, it's traditionalism versus liberalism. Really, the traditional line, again, it comes back to a divine nature spoken through a given person to a given people over time, or at least a given people make something that was universal unique in their own way. Of course, you find that all the time in Christianity and so on. You might have the Anglican Church or whatever, Catholic Church, very Italian and so on. But the point is, there's something to an Englishman, to you and I, when you hear church bells on a Sunday, and if you said, even if you're Christian or not, that's going to go away, that would
mm,
hurt us because it's
mm.
part of who we are.
Yep.
Christmas carols are part of who we are, hymns are part of who we are,
Yeah.
because it's the uniqueness of the English spirit. Now, again, the idea of liberalism is, oh, we just bring everyone together and we welcome each other's cultures. But that's actually a smokescreen because again it's only through the traditional model that you allow a given culture and a given people the supremacy they need to create a civilization.
Mm,
That makes sense, and they need that dominance, and that's natural, that's normal. No other time in history have we had just all these different cultures and all these magical individuals popping up. Oh, Shakespeare's over there, and there's Rumi. That's not what it's going to be like. Shakespeare needs England, Rumi
mm,
needs Persia, and so on.
mm,
So again, the point is we have to respect cultures and respect their foundations. Doesn't mean there can't be economic, cultural exchange, even a bit of immigration, but it means we have
mm,
to respect these things. And if we do want this universal humanity in the same place, you've got to work to it over decades. You've got to make sure we have this perennialist understanding of spirituality, if you like. Make sure all the people are on board. If they're not, then it's just a non-starter. But the liberal world doesn't think like that. They just pile everyone in and say, you're a racist if this isn't working out great. And the
mm,
reason they do that, despite all the sexy marketing that, gets all the naive students on board and the leftist ideologues, is because what it's really about, once you break it all down, is money. It's about economics. It's about bringing a workforce in and blocking a national unified voice to say, we don't want this.
mm,
Everyone here does not want this corruption of our country, but they know if a country is, full of everyone from all around the world, there's no unified voice. It's all different stories going on all the time. And second to that, they can also import a cheap workforce, which is exactly what's happened here in the UK. That's why they're so pro mass immigration. It inflates the economy. There's a massive black market that keeps things ticking over, and it allows big business to keep functioning with wage rates relatively low.
mm,
And on top of that, the international rich have come and bought houses here, which has pumped up the prices for the average person just trying to build a house and get on the housing ladder. So in essence, the point I'm getting at is a lot of the whether we view it as the lefties are just naive or whether there are some clever people behind the scenes who unified the liberal ideology with the excesses of the globalist market, globalist capitalism is up for debate. But it's no doubt there's no doubt that it's happened, and it's all a massive smokescreen. So when this whole multiculturalism, a celebration of culture, it's not.
no.
It's not. It's a complete devaluation of culture, and it's gutting it out from the inside again to serve liberalism. And just a final note on that, and I've made videos about this before. This is why, like, a lot of Muslims are cocky at the moment. Christianity's fallen apart. Okay, they're right about that. You've lost all your values. Yeah, largely true about that. Your women, well, they're acting like whores. Again, a lot of the time, unfortunately, they're right about that. But they've got to be careful because they're really playing the same game as the Christians were. They're getting way too into a decadent worldview. You see the same underlying woke logic is getting into Islam. And there's a battle going on now between Islam and wokeism. It's that lovely quote, from Nietzsche, be careful when you look into the abyss, lest the abyss look back at you.
Mm,
And that's what's going on. And you think, oh, be careful there with their tradition. And sometimes I think I don't know. I sometimes think Christendom might actually, when you break it all down, be in a slightly better position because we've gone through all that now. We've had everything from all of the ammo and unrelenting critique from the new atheist, endless materialism. And we're starting to actually come out the other side and hopefully, like I say, I pray reaching this stage of rebirth eventually where we do reawaken our tradition, maybe in a new way. As I say, I can't predict what it'll be, maybe in a new way. But it sometimes seems to me that Islam, though it may well be in the ascendancy at the moment, I look around the world, you see Muslims in the West, they're taking on lots of the woke language, they're part of intersectionality. Then you look at Dubai, Saudi, a lot of money, a lot of decadence there. I
mm.
sometimes think, I don't know, I can see trouble there personally.
Richard, that leads me really nicely onto my last question because you spoke there again about the sort of rebirth and what's going to happen once potentially we see if Christianity's been through all these attacks, all this undermining, coming through the other side, and there's going to be some sort of civilizational rebirth. I just wonder because I sometimes think about this. Does it make you wish that you were actually born a little bit later? Like, so that you could enjoy this potentially this civilizational rebirth as a sort of younger man? Because I think, as you've said, you think that you and I will probably be sort of old men by the time we see not a utopia, because again, I don't think people on people in our camp, so to speak, sort of really are utopians, but a much better world. Does it make you wish you were born a little bit later? Does it make you wish that you were sort of like a child now witnessing all this and you'd be in your prime, or potentially, around your prime when things sort of improve?
I suppose on a human level, yes, but I think on a on the spiritual level, I wouldn't say so, simply because again, you have recourse for God, and God is eternal, and I don't want to get too deep for those who aren't drawn to this sort of thing, but you have the belief that you are where you are now, and you say whatever is true now, and there is eternity in the spirit, and wherever we are on the cycle. I think the like you say, things are good at some points, they're bad at others. Sometimes they're a mix of good and bad. We'll never find perfection in the world, but the only true place we can find perfection is in the spirit. And that's true wherever you are. In fact, it may even be more true when you're on the decline rather than the up. So yeah, that would be my line on that.
Beautiful, lovely answer. Thanks so much for that, Richard. Quite comforting because sometimes I feel like I'm getting on a little bit and I'm not going to get to see all these exciting developments that are going to happen. But yeah, a very nice, comforting thought. Richard, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. I know we've obviously gone a little bit over the hour, but thanks so much for all the insights. Really interesting conversation. And yeah, would love to do it again and maybe speak about some, similar themes, slightly different themes. I would love that. So thanks so much.
No, you're more than welcome. Yeah, very, very interesting conversation. And yeah, be more than happy to chat again at some point.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Richard.